Whether it is more common or less common is really immaterial. There is likelihood that partners may have differences and may have disputes among themselves. So is it better then to be in a position of exposed to this kind of disputes among partners? Or it is better that you own your property, you bear your own risk, and when you sell the property, it becomes owned by the other person, the buyer, and the buyer bears its risk then. So you transfer the risk with the property, and then you have nothing to do with that risk. There is no concept of sharing. So the concept of sharing itself is not really consistent with the human fitra, with the human nature. Risk sharing is more costly than risk aversion, as a matter of fact. This is well-known fact. But no, I want to say one more thing here, which I read in a recent paper by one of the good writers, as a matter of fact, but sometimes everyone has some pitfalls. The writer says that we need regulations by the central banks that would force Islamic banks to make, to provide finance on mudaraba and on musharaka. And of course, when you do that, there is also additional cost for these regulations, and who should bear this additional cost? And why should we need regulations to force them to take more risk? And the natural thing and the fitra is to take less risk. And the fitra also is not to share risk rather than sharing risk. We share risk only when we need to, and out of really kind of necessity. When the size of the firm cannot work without sharing, then we pool resources together and we share risk to create the appropriate size of the firm. But that's another issue really. But again here, the fitra is to avoid risk, not to, rather than to share. Non-predictability of risk sharing may cause monetary and financial disturbances, and that is observed, of course, in the market. So that creates an additional burden on the market. Risk-return relationship is not a causality relationship. It's rather an accompanying relationship. Risk accompanies higher risk, accompanies higher potential return. But it is not the cause of higher potential return. The cause of the return is what you own, and that is that ownership that created the addition or the return. Risk is of multiple layers and multiple levels and multiple kinds. Which one that should be shared and where and why? Lastly, the failure to distinguish between market risk and ownership risk. In Sharia, continuously, I should say, and across the board, we talk about ownership risk, not really risk sharing. Ownership risk is a sign or a test. We take it sometimes as a test. It's a sign and a test of completion of the ownership. You may own a thing, but if you don't bear its risk, then your ownership is incomplete. Like when you buy an item, but you did not take delivery yet of it. The owner, the risk of that item remains with the seller until the seller makes that delivery. And once you take delivery, then we consider that, then only you can deserve any increment that may happen in it. But before that, you do not deserve that increment because your ownership is not even complete. So we consider, we take the risk bearing as a test of completion of ownership and not really as a reason for the creation of the addition. Now, in the property theory of finance, none of price risk, liquidity risk, or credit risk may justify earning. What justifies earning is the ownership and that is associated with the ownership risk, creation or the existence of an increment in an owned property. If an increment happens in an owned property, then you deserve that increment. The owner deserves that increment. This is what both the maqasid and the individual text of Sharia require and ordain. Obviously, ownership risk is there, but also it is not shared. It is not the sharing concept. There is a risk, obviously. You have to bear risk, but you don't have to share risk. And of course, without bearing risk, you cannot, your ownership is not complete, and therefore you cannot create any earning out of that property. Then talking about a new theory of finance, a theory that has its economic and legal foundations derived from this religion, not derived really from any experience outside our religion, from the text and understanding the religion. Entitlement for return is caused by ownership of a property. And those who own property can deserve or do deserve the return of that property. This is a general theory in Islamic finance, Islamic economics and finance. It applies all through, including production, its factors, distribution, development, and creation of added value. The three channels of finance, sale, leasing, and sharing, translate into four axiomatic principles. These are earning by owning. Financial assets are mere representation of what do they represent, and we will see that we apply to them really the rules of what they represent, as if financial assets do not exist at all. We do not recognize them. As a matter of fact, I would say to the extent that we in Islamic economics and finance are blindfolded toward financial assets. We only treat them as mere representation of the real assets. The principle, the realism also, the axiom of realism and the axiom of moral commitment. These are not maqasid al-sharia and not part of the maqasid. These are fundamentals of Islamic finance. These three channels of finance also imply that the characteristics of return in Islamic finance are, there is a necessary condition, a necessary characteristic that without which there will be no return in finance at all, in Islamic finance. that is owning a property, a goods or assets or anything that is able to generate added value. So the sufficient conditions are the property should be able to generate increment, and the property should be able to pass the moral test. This also implies that financial securities are mere representation of their underlying real assets. They are not, financial assets are not assets in themselves. We always look at what do they represent and apply the rules of their underlying assets all the time. And we don't, I mean, this is the famous example is how do we deal with a share? A share in a company is of today is not like a share of the same company of tomorrow, although the number of shares is still the same. But we look at not at the share, we look at what the share represents, and the share represents is the total assets minus total liabilities, and when we talk about assets, including market capitalization. So we always look at that, at financial assets as mere representation, not really added assets. Islamic finance is then a universal reform of finance. It is finance for the real economy. And of course, when we look at Islamic finance as such, again, there is something missing. I don't know how it is now, how these slides are moving. Really, it looks to me that something is doing something funny. Okay. Now, anyway, upon recognizing this new theory of Islamic finance, property theory of Islamic finance, we need anew to deal with the risk, with development, with the ethical and moralities in finance, and also with the issue of contribution to society. These are four areas that Islamic finance has been under scrutiny and under a lot of discussion by many writers who do not really, and I would always accuse them that they do not fundamentally refer to the Sharia itself. They refer to ideas that are strange from Sharia. So let's deal with these one by one in a quick way. Risk and Islamic finance. The risk issue and risk map in finance have always to undertake deep changes based on the property theory. Risk is a fact of life, and it is a fact of life that life is surrounded with and paved with by risk, a matter which makes risk management a part of the venture of life itself in whatever we do. So we deal with risk all the time, and we always manage risk all the time in actions or in properties, in all our activities. How do we deal with risk in Islamic finance? Risk is not an asset. No risk trading, no risk sale, and no risk exchange insurance contract. That is why the Islamic alternative is to cooperate to mitigate risk rather than to sell risk. No exchange contract in risk. Justice requires earn by owning, and owner bears property risk. So there is a risk that you bear, but you bear property risk as an owner and not in any other capacity. Islamic banks have to bear ownership risk because they must own to earn, in addition to credit risk because they finance. Of course, when we talk about Islamic banks, they provide finance. And if you finance, that means definitely you have to bear a credit risk. But in addition to credit risk, in Islamic finance, we have to bear property risk. Without it, the profit is not justification. Now, credit risk and credit risk sharing do not justify earning in Islamic finance at all, even with the credit risk sharing. Number 4, there is no Sharia or legal or market requirement that Islamic banks or Islamic financial institutions must bear market, that is price and liquidity risks of or economic fluctuation risk. That's not their job, that's not their business. Number 5, wakala in Islamic financial institutions requires minimizing all kinds of risk. And of course, it requires avoiding risks that can be avoided, that are avoidable. Rules of prudence require advanced knowledge of cash inflow, both in size and in maturity, and also requires liquidity matching. Commercial Islamic banks or commercial banks, Islamic and others, have legal and economic responsibility to observe effects on monetary and economic system of their action or lack of action. So in other words, when you finance on mudaraba and you have unpredictable return, you may create a disturbance in the financial and monetary system. So we need to avoid these as much as that is possible. How do we deal with property risk? Definitely, property risk must be borne, must be taken. Without property risk, you don't earn, because property risk is attached all the time to ownership. It's a facet of ownership. It's a characteristic of ownership. If you don't have it, your ownership is not complete, and then you do not deserve any earning. So you must bear the property risk. Yet, it can be minimized and it can be mitigated both ways. So you should minimize it as much as possible, and you should also mitigate it if it is better to mitigate it depending on the risk-bearing level. Market risk, both price and liquidity, can be avoided by focusing on debt-creating, value-generating, exit-definite product. These kind of product, debt-creating, value-generating, and exit-definite, all these are necessary for any commercial financial institution, and therefore you need to focus on these kind of product rather than on unpredictable product. As for the credit risk, definitely you have to bear credit risk. The issue of development, Islamic finance, there are talks that we should focus on financing investment. Risk sharing finances investment, finances businesses, and don't finance consumers. Where does this come from? Does it come from Sharia, or it comes from being in a backward country that we need to focus on growth, more on development? Now, if we were in America, probably we should focus on consumer financing better. And probably you may remember that America always criticizes China because of the low focus on consumer goods inside China, and instead the focus on investment and export. And always Americans always advise the Chinese that you should increase the level of living, the welfare of your own people, and you don't leave them that poor. We have a precedent, in fact, by our Prophet ﷺ, when he asked the question, who among you the property of his heir is more dear to him